We are dropping you straight into the climax of an ancient showdown today. And look, we're not going to sugarcoat the stakes here.
No, definitely not.
Right, so today's deep dive is dissecting Lecture 7 of 14 from the Totally Islam digital audio series. And we're looking specifically at Surah Ta-Ha, verses 71 through 76. And the scene we're unpacking is essentially, well, it's the blueprint for how power shatters.
It really is. It's the moment the illusion breaks.
Exactly. So on one side, you have Moses, right?
Sure.
And he's just presented this piece of empirical, undeniable truth. And on the other side, you have Pharaoh's elite magicians. And we have to remember, these are not, they aren't just street performers doing card tricks.
Right. No, these are the architects of the state's official narrative. They're the top intellectuals.
Yeah. They are tasked with maintaining these psychological illusions that literally keep the regime in power. So Moses drops his truth, the illusions are shattered, and the magicians, instead of doing their job, instead of, spinning the propaganda, they defect.
Just right there in public?
Right there.
Mm-hmm.
In public. They recognize the empirical truth, and they just fold.
Which triggers a reaction from the state that we need to analyze very, very carefully. Because the text describes Pharaoh flying into just a complete rage. I mean, he accuses Moses of being this secret cult leader, the so-called chief who taught the magicians their craft.
Yeah, the conspiracy theory angle.
Exactly. And then the decree comes down, right? He threatens to chop off the hands and feet of these defectors on opposite sides and then crucify them on the trunks of palm trees.
I mean, the imagery is just incredibly graphic. It reads like a horrific ancient horror movie or something. It feels like this massive overreaction, right? Like a dictator just throwing a violent tantrum because he got publicly embarrassed.
It is graphic, yeah, but we really have to cut through the sensationalism of the gore here. What the source material points out is that this is not, it's not just a random psychological meltdown. It is the textbook structural behavior of a collapsing autocracy.
Okay, wait, unpack that.
Yeah.
Structural behavior.
Right. So when a regime relies entirely on psychological illusions, what the text calls magic, but, what we would call state-sponsored propaganda or gaslighting to maintain its power, that power is inherently brittle. The moment those illusions are exposed as fake by clear, undeniable proof, the state loses its mind.
But I wanted to push back on that slightly. Why does the state have to lose its mind? Like, why couldn't an autocrat like Pharaoh just pivot?
Yeah.
Just say, okay, interesting trick, Moses. Let's incorporate that into our system. Why does it immediately escalate to asymmetric physical terror, to crucifixion?
Because autocracies built on illusion cannot tolerate empirical proof. They just can't. They cannot win a debate. If Pharaoh attempts to debate Moses or the magicians, he's basically acknowledging that they operate on a level playing field.
Oh, right. Like he'd be admitting that truth is determined by evidence, not by his royal decree.
Exactly. And the state has no intellectual counter-argument to the truth, so it abandons all pretense of the rule of law. It just drops the facade of civilized governance completely and resorts to sheer physical terror to regain control of the populace.
Wow.
Yeah, the threat of crucifixion isn't actually about punishing the magicians. The magicians are already lost to him. The brutal public nature of the violence is a message to the audience watching. It's this desperate attempt to use physical horror to override cognitive realization.
Which completely shifts our mission for this deep dive, really, because we are entirely bypassing the traditional, the passive focus on martyrdom here. We are not looking at this as a story of people just standing around waiting to be victims out of some morbid desire for death.
No, not at all.
We are exploring the ultimate intellectual triumph over state terrorism. So we're going to unpack the arrogant linguistics of tyranny, the absolute social physics of human action, and the actual mechanics of human potential.
And that requires a fundamental shift in perspective for the listener. We have to look at this through the lens of structural social dynamics. The source material demands that we treat this text not as historical storytelling, but as a deep analysis of how human systems operate under extreme pressure.
Let's start with the linguistics then, because there is this one phrase Pharaoh uses in Surah 20, verse 71, that just exposes the entire psychology of a tyrant. He looks at his defecting magicians, these people who just witnessed a self-evident truth, and he screams, "You believe in him before I give you permission."
Yeah, the Arabic word used there is idan, which translates to permission, authorization, or leave. And it is just a fascinating window into totalitarian arrogance.
It's almost absurd, "Before I give you permission."
Yeah.
I mean, imagine a citizen watching an apple fall from a tree, recognizing the existence of gravity, and then being told they committed a crime because they didn't apply for a government-issued license to acknowledge that gravity exists.
It sounds absurd to us, sure, but to a totalitarian, it is a deadly serious structural necessity. A dictator doesn't just want to control your physical movements or, collect your taxes. The ultimate goal of a totalitarian system is to claim ownership over the cognitive functions of its people.
They literally want to own your brain.
Yes. The state believes it must authorize your perception of reality itself.
But practically speaking, how does a state enforce cognitive ownership? Like you can lock up a physical body in a cell, but you can't police a thought inside someone's head.
Well, you police the expression of the thought, and eventually the population polices their own minds out of fear. I mean, if empirical facts contradict the state narrative, the autocrat's position is that the facts themselves are illegal. To accept a self-evident truth without state authorization is treated as an act of treason.
Because it makes the state look weak.
More than weak, obsolete. Because if the citizens develop the capacity to recognize empirical facts on their own, the dictator becomes structurally obsolete. The regime's survival depends entirely on the populace outsourcing their judgment to the state.
So when the magicians make their own judgment, they're not just breaking a law, they're dismantling the foundational premise of Pharaoh's entire authority.
Exactly, which is why he immediately deploys a deflection tactic. When the truth shatters the state narrative, the autocrat cannot, under any circumstances, admit that the truth is self-evident.
Because doing so would validate the truth and invalidate his authority.
Spot on. So he has to frame it as a conspiracy.
And that is where the chief who taught you magic line comes in. Pharaoh claims this was all an inside job.
He has to invent a hidden hand. The narrative shifts from you recognized a superior truth to you were manipulated by a foreign plot. He claims Moses is actually their boss, and they all plan this public defeat together just to embarrass the state.
It turns an intellectual defeat into a national security crisis.
Yeah.
That's incredibly manipulative.
That is the crucial mechanism. By framing it as a conspiracy and a threat to national security, the autocrat manufactures the justification to use military-grade violence against an intellectual movement. It gives him the excuse to bring out the palm tree trunks.
It's gaslighting on a civilizational scale. And what is really incredible is how the magicians respond to this pressure. Because before Pharaoh even makes his threat, their initial reaction to Moses' truth is described in the text with the word sajda, which is typically translated as prostration.
Right.
And when we hear that word, we usually default to a very passive visual. We imagine someone dropping to their knees, putting their forehead in the dirt, and completely surrendering.
Yeah, but the source material, which is heavily influenced by the poetic philosophy of Allama Iqbal, pushes back hard against that purely physical, traditional visual. If we view sajda only as a physical posture, we miss the entire cognitive revolution happening in that specific moment.
I struggle a bit with separating the physical from the intellectual here, though. Historically, it is a physical act of lowering oneself. Are we just, retrofitting a modern intellectual philosophy onto an ancient ritual to make it sound more sophisticated?
It's not a retrofit at all. It's uncovering the root mechanism. Iqbal frames true sajda as an intellectual submission to absolute truth. The physical posture is merely a localized manifestation of a profound internal realignment.
Okay, internal realignment.
Yeah. It is the moment the human mind recognizes an undeniable, higher reality and structurally aligns itself with it. And the brilliant paradox of this intellectual submission is that when you submit to the ultimate empirical truth, that single act frees you from having to bow to 1,000 false gods.
I see the distinction. So the false gods aren't just like stone statues in a temple.
Far from it. False gods are tyrants like Pharaoh. They are suffocating societal pressures. They are the demands of unchecked materialism or corrupt systems.
So when the magicians performed sajda, they weren't just putting their heads in the dirt. They were running a complex calculation.
Exactly. They calculated the exact price of Pharaoh's false godhood. They weighed his threats, his political power, his illusions, and they realized his market value was zero compared to the absolute truth they had just witnessed.
They ran the numbers and realized the tyrant was totally bankrupt. That framing makes their next move the most logical step, rather than some mystical leap of faith. Let's look at their epic reply to Pharaoh's threat of crucifixion. They're facing dismemberment, and their response is, Fakima anta qadin, meaning, so execute whatever you are going to execute. You can only judge this world or life.
What really stands out in the linguistic structure of that reply is the complete absence of panic. I mean, there is no pleading, there's no bargaining, no emotional outburst whatsoever.
It is a cold, calculated cost-benefit analysis. It's the engine of reason operating at maximum efficiency under extreme duress.
They have completely stripped Pharaoh of his psychological terror. They are essentially telling him that his jurisdiction has hard mathematical limits.
I kind of think of it in terms of a modern computer network. The defectors are looking Pharaoh dead in the eye and explaining the limits of his administrative access.
No, I like that.
Yeah, they're saying, you have admin access to the hardware, you can smash the monitor, you can break the keyboard, you can physically destroy our biological bodies, but you have zero access to the cloud. You cannot rewrite the software.
That's a perfect analogy. The software in this case is what the text calls al-bayina, which translates to clear, indisputable proof. Once that proof is downloaded into the human consciousness, state violence becomes entirely impotent against it.
But wait, is it really impotent? Because smashing the hardware still kills the person. If Pharaoh kills them, hasn't he won? I mean, he silenced the truth.
He silenced their vocal cords, sure, but he failed to force a retraction. And that is the crucial distinction in this power dynamic. Totalitarianism doesn't just want to kill you. It wants to break your mind and force you to publicly deny the truth, which validates the state's illusion.
Oh, wow. So by killing them without getting the retraction, he actually loses.
Exactly. By refusing to deny the bayina, the magicians deny Pharaoh his actual objective. State violence can only affect the physical realm, this worldly life, as they said. It cannot touch the integrity of the truth itself, nor can it touch the intellectual integrity of the person who has accepted it.
This raises a massive question about the rest of the society, though. Why were these specific individuals able to achieve this level of intellectual resilience, while the average citizen standing in the crowd was probably terrified into total silence? The source material makes a really vital distinction here between two concepts, taqlid and basira.
Yeah, this is really the epistemological core of the lecture. Taqlid refers to blind faith. It's following tradition without questioning or adopting the beliefs of your ancestors simply because it's culturally comfortable. It is the default operating system of a stagnant society.
So taqlid is like believing a bridge is safe because everyone else is walking on it, without ever checking the engineering reports yourself.
That's a great way to put it. And in a low-stakes environment, taqlid might seem sufficient for social cohesion. You just go with the flow. But the source argues that the defectors did not accept Moses' message based on taqlid. If they had just blindly followed Moses because he was charismatic, or because his staff turning into a serpent was a visually impressive trick, Pharaoh's threat of crucifixion would have easily broken them.
Because fear shatters blind faith.
Yeah.
If you don't really know why you believe something, the moment a literal weapon is pointed at you, you will abandon that belief instantly.
Exactly. Blind faith has no structural root system. It is easily uprooted by systemic pressure. The defectors, however, accepted the truth based on basira. And basira means deep reasoned insight. It is belief built entirely on undeniable evidence and rigorous internal logic.
They saw the bayina, the clear proof, and they internalized it through basira.
When you hold a belief based on basira, you have run the calculations yourself. You know it is true, regardless of external validation or external pressure. Fear cannot shatter basira because fear is an emotional response, and basira is an empirical foundation.
I want you listening to this to stop for a second and evaluate your own internal operating system. Think about your core beliefs, your political leanings, your ethical boundaries. Are they held by taqlid? Are you just surfing the cultural inertia of your peer group? Because if you are, the moment you face systemic pressure, the moment your career is threatened, or society threatens your reputation, or you face the modern equivalent of the palm tree trunks you will fold, you won't have a choice.
You really won't. You cannot borrow someone else's basira. You have to construct it yourself.
But if you do the work, if your worldview is built on the unshakable foundation of clear proof, you become structurally immune to intimidation. You could look systemic pressure in the eye and say, execute what you will.
It completely neutralizes the tyrant's only remaining weapon. But we really have to move beyond the immediate confrontation here and look at the actual long-term consequences these individuals are weighing. We transition to Ayat 74 and 75, which lay out what the source material calls social physics.
Let's define social physics for a second. It sounds like we're applying, thermodynamics to human behavior.
In a way we are. The Quranic text does not present moral platitudes. It lays out absolute structural laws of cause and effect in human action. It is the law of requital. Every action has an inevitable structural reaction, not just in some metaphysical afterlife, but in the immediate architecture of society.
The text profiles two specific archetypes to illustrate this social physics, the mujrim and the mu'min. And traditionally, I've always heard mujrim translated simply as criminal or sinner, like, someone who robs a bank.
Right, but the source material demands we look at the structural definition. The mujrim is the systemic exploiter. It is not just an individual who commits a petty crime. It is an individual or an entire system represented perfectly by Pharaoh that survives by suppressing truth, exploiting the labor and intellect of others, and intentionally arresting human development just to maintain its own power monopoly.
So a system that relies on keeping its populace uneducated and terrified is structurally a mujrim system.
Yes, and the structural opposite of that is the mu'min. Again, tradition often flattens this word to mean just a believer, like someone who holds a specific religious dogma in their head. But the text defines the mu'min through action. A mu'min, represented here by the defectors, is a constructive builder.
Someone who aligns themselves with absolute truth and takes concrete steps to create equilibrium and justice.
Exactly. Now, this leads us to the most radical paradigm shift in the source material. The destinations of these two archetypes. The text discusses the destination of the mujrim, which is Jahannam, traditionally translated as hell.
And this is where we have to completely discard the medieval mythological visual. We're not talking about an underworld cavern with fire, brimstone, and little demons poking people with pitchforks.
No, that imagery distracts entirely from the terrifying structural reality the text is actually describing. The verse describes the state of Jahannam with a highly specific phrase. It is a state where one neither dies nor lives.
Neither dies nor lives. I want to linger on that. If we are applying social physics, what does a state of living death actually look like for a society or an individual?
Structurally, if a society is based on the mujrim model, exploitation, suppression of truth, intellectual monopoly, it completely loses its capacity to evolve. It becomes paralyzed, innovation stops, intellectual growth halts.
I'm thinking of a corporate analogy here. Imagine a massive toxic corporation where innovation is actively punished because it threatens middle management, right? The bureaucracy is so thick that no one can change a single process. So the company stops growing, it produces nothing of value, but it has so much accumulated capital that it never fully goes bankrupt and dies. It just limps along for decades. It's a zombie corporation.
That is the precise structural dynamic, a state of living death. You are entirely stripped of your human potential, paralyzed by the system you created or bought into, yet you are still painfully aware of your existence. You cannot move forward, and you are not granted the release of non-existence. Pharaoh's autocracy is already entering a state of Jahannam because its survival depends on stunting the intellectual growth of its citizens.
So when the defectors look at Pharaoh, they aren't seeing a god. They're looking at a man trapped in a burning, stagnant building of his own making, offering them a job in middle management. They realize that participating in his societal stagnation is a fate far worse than physical crucifixion.
They completely reject the living death. Which brings us to the alternative. Jannat al-Adn, often translated as the Garden of Eden, or paradise.
And just like we ripped apart the mythological hell, we have to rip apart the passive myth of paradise here. The idea that it's a place where you sit on a cloud, play a harp, and eat peeled grapes for eternity while doing absolutely nothing.
The passive view of paradise violates the fundamental physics of these verses. The text explicitly states that the high degrees al-Darajat al-Ula and Jannat al-Adn belong exclusively to those who execute Amila as-Salihat.
We really need to unpack Amila al-Salihat. It usually gets translated as righteous deeds, which sounds very, subjective. What is the structural definition?
Amila means concrete actions, tangible deeds in the real world. The root of salihat means to repair, to reform, to bring into a state of equilibrium, to resolve conflicts, and create constructive solutions.
So it's engineering terminology. It's not about having good intentions or feeling warm and fuzzy. It's about executing actions that repair a broken system.
Therefore, Jannat al-Adn is not a magical resort. It is defined as an enduring, structurally stable society built on justice, continuous human evolution, and the actualization of potential. It is the direct, logical result of constructive action.
It perfectly contrasts with Pharaoh's empire. Pharaoh's system is built on terror and illusion, which means it is mathematically guaranteed to collapse. It's built on quicksand. The society built on Amila al-Salihat is built on bedrock. It is designed to endure.
But the text adds another layer in verse 76. It states that this structurally sound paradise, these high ranks, are the reward for those who purify or develop themselves. The Arabic word used is tazkiya.
And purify yourself is another phrase that sounds incredibly abstract. It sounds like something a guru on a mountain tells you to do while you meditate. How do you structurally execute tazkiya?
The source material provides a deeply grounded answer by analyzing the agricultural root of the word tazkiya. It relates directly to plant growth and pruning.
I love this concept. Let's visualize this. Imagine your core self, your human personality, as a seed.
A seed contains immense locked potential. It has the blueprint and the capability to become a massive, fruit-bearing tree. But that potential remains completely dormant as long as the seed just sits on a shelf. It requires specific conditions to actualize.
It has to be planted. And the medium it gets planted in is the soil. In this specific metaphor, what does the soil represent?
The soil represents the material world. It is our physical bodies, our economic realities, our careers, our families, our daily societal interactions.
And this is where I think a lot of philosophies get it totally wrong. Many spiritual traditions argue that the material world is inherently corrupt, and that to achieve spiritual purity, you must hate the soil. You have to become an ascetic, leave society, and go live in a cave.
The agricultural metaphor dismantles that ascetic worldview completely. A seed must have soil to grow. Without the material world, human potential has no friction, nothing to push against, and no nutrients to draw from. You cannot develop a robust moral character in a vacuum. You need the complexities of the material world to test and actualize your potential.
However, there is a massive caveat here. If you take a heavy, compacted clod of dirt and drop it directly on top of a fragile seed, the sprout will be crushed before it ever breaks the surface.
That heavy clod of dirt represents unchecked, unguided materialism. It is the pursuit of wealth, power, or physical gratification without any ethical framework or universal values. When the material environment becomes too heavy and suffocating, the human potential is just crushed.
So you absolutely need the soil, but you cannot allow the soil to bury you. How do you maintain the balance?
You introduce water. In this structural metaphor, water represents divine values, universal principles, and absolute truth. The water softens the heavy clods of dirt. It breaks down the rigid materialism, making the nutrients accessible to the seed, and creates a balanced environment where the sprout can push through the soil and actually grow toward the light.
Tazkiya, then, is not a one-time purification ritual. It is the active, continuous process of agricultural maintenance in your own life. It is ensuring that your material pursuits are constantly softened and guided by ethical principles so that your potential can bloom.
Which requires constant vigilance and course correction. Because we make mistakes. We let the soil get too heavy. We take the wrong path.
That transitions perfectly into the mechanics of course correction.
Yeah.
Because in our historical example, the defectors made an immediate, calculated pivot toward the truth the absolute second they saw the Baqina. But what about the other side of the coin? What about a tyrant like Pharaoh? Let's say a systemic exploiter lives his entire life crushing seeds and piling on the dirt and then gets cornered by death at the very end. If he suddenly cries out, "I repent, I believe," does that structural calculation hold any weight?
To answer that, the source material breaks down the linguistic root of another heavily misunderstood word, toba, which is usually translated as repentance.
And in modern parlance, repentance has been reduced to just an emotional state. It means feeling really guilty and saying, "I'm sorry," hoping you avoid punishment.
Linguistically, taba is not an emotion, it is a vector. It's an action word. The root meaning is to return. But it specifically means realizing you took the wrong path at a crossroads, stopping your forward momentum, physically turning around, walking all the way back to the exact crossroads where you made the error, and then walking down the correct path.
It requires kinetic energy. I visualize it like a GPS system. Imagine you were driving on a highway and you realize you missed your correct exit 50 miles ago.
True taba is not sitting in the driver's seat crying about being lost.
Exactly. The GPS recalculates the route, but you have to actually turn the steering wheel. You have to expend the fuel to drive the 50 miles back in the opposite direction, get back to the exit, and then drive down the right highway. You have to put in the miles. You have to execute the amila al-salihat, the constructive actions to repair the trajectory.
This physical requirement of tauba explains mathematically why a deathbed repentance from a systemic exploiter is structurally invalid. Pharaoh's future regret, when he is eventually cornered by the physical reality of death, means absolutely nothing in the physics of Tauba.
If we use the car analogy, it's like Pharaoh has driven his car off a cliff. He is in midair, plummeting toward the jagged rocks, and he screams at his GPS, recalculate. Recalculate.
The GPS can recalculate all it wants, but he has no road left to drive on. The time for constructive action has expired. He cannot return to the crossroads because his temporal agency is gone. The system has reached its absolute structural conclusion.
The defectors' victory was valid precisely because they used their agency while they still had road left. They didn't wait until they were literally nailed to the palm trees to admit they were wrong. They saw the proof, stopped their momentum, and executed Tauba in real time under immense pressure. They recalculated their route and immediately started walking the path of truth, fully aware of the physical consequences.
They utilized their human potential to its maximum capacity, securing their position in a structurally stable reality, regardless of what happened to their physical hardware.
Which brings this massive exploration right back to you, the listener. We've dissected ancient autocrats, the linguistics of tyranny, the physics of stagnation, and the mechanics of human potential. But none of this matters if it stays trapped in the realm of ancient history. I want you to evaluate your own internal architecture today.
Consider the societal and professional systems you operate within every single day.
You will face systemic pressure. It probably won't be a pharaoh threatening you with a palm tree trunk, but it might be a suffocating corporate culture that demands you compromise your ethics for a promotion. It might be a social circle that demands compliance with a toxic ideology. It might be the overwhelming noise of political gaslighting telling you that empirical facts don't matter. When you face that pressure, what is your operating system? Do you rely on tackle it? Do you fold because it's culturally easier to bow down? Or have you done the intellectual labor? Do you possess the basira, the clear proof required to look that pressure in the eye, recognize that it only has power over your temporary material circumstances, and say, execute what you will?
It is the ultimate test of cognitive sovereignty. The defectors prove that a mind anchored in absolute empirical truth cannot be broken by state terror or systemic pressure. They won the war of the mind, completely neutralizing Pharaoh's terror apparatus without ever picking up a weapon.
But the reality of their situation is that neutralizing the terror apparatus intellectually doesn't make the physical danger disappear.
Not at all. The ideological victory belongs to Moses, but the physical threat is still very real. Pharaoh's army is mobilizing, and the newly liberated movement is about to be physically cornered against an inescapable body of water. In Lecture 8 of 14, covering Ayat 77 through 82, the macro strategy changes from public debate to full civilizational exodus. We're going to talk about the physical mechanics of the sea crossing and the absolute disruption of the Egyptian military engine. Don't miss it.
So until that next deep dive, remember the structural X-ray we applied today. The failing health of a system might not be immediately visible on the surface, but when you look through the lens of social physics, the fractures of a dying system are everywhere. Don't let the noise of the mudra make you doubt the empirical gravity you can observe with your own intellect. Keep your soil balanced, cultivate your basira, and we will see you next time.